Welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is Anomalies number 151. And though it's not a special number in particular, I do have a very special guest today, and his name is Jeffrey Wilson. He goes by Jeff. He is the co-founder and director of the Independent Crop Circle Researchers Association. And Jeff, welcome to the show. I've been looking forward to talking with you. We met a couple decades ago, we determined, online discussing the crop circle phenomenon. That's what we'll be talking about today. Jeff
I
has
appreciate I
a,
appreciate the invitation to come on. It's always
you
fun to
are
chat
welcome. Thank you for being
about crop
on.
circles with people who have a genuine interest.
Yeah. I've got a few decades under my belt wondering what the heck is going on with this stuff. And, we're having you here to hopefully elucidate a few of the bizarre details, surrounding this phenomenon. You do have it's something that I deeply appreciate, and that is a background in sciences. And you've got one foot firmly planted in that arena, but you've also been dipping your toe in the realm of the bizarre. You got feet in both worlds, and it's pretty rare. Um,
Yeah,
there are a lot of enthusiasts, in quotes, who are interested in this stuff, but they don't really have the scientific background. They don't have the critical thinking. And that's another reason I appreciate guests such as yourself. So, can you tell us about your scientific background before we get into the whole crop circle issue?
sure. I got a master's degree in general science from Eastern Michigan University, and I was studying astronomy and physics and remote sensing. I did my master's thesis on a grant from NASA on the Lunar Prospector mission, which was in the mid 90s. And so I also had, kind of an undergraduate background. One of my minors was in earth science. I studied geology too. So I had a pretty wide range of scientific training in a bunch of different disciplines. And I thought that part of it for me in branching out into all that stuff was just to satisfy my own scientific interests in things. But one of the things that I was also interested in at the same time was I began to be interested in crop circles as far back as 1988. And in 1988, I happened to see a short television segment uh, in which Dr. George Terence Meaden from England, the atmospheric physicist who wrote the very first book on crop circles called The Circles Effect and Its Mysteries, he was being interviewed about his research findings. And I got really interested in what he was doing and interested in the crop circles. And I could not get a single academic sponsor to do a legitimate academic study of the crop circles at Eastern. No one would touch it with a 10-foot pole. So I ended up, doing other things. But I continued my research into that, outside of those academic pursuits.
I do remember the name Terence Meaden. It's been a while since I've heard that name.
Yeah.
His uh, his model was it the explain remind me what the model was, a vortex
Well,
a
he
vortex. Was
was
he the one who?
he was in charge of a group with the acronym TORO, which was like a tornado research organization. And so
Mhm.
he was interested in atmospheric vortices.
Right.
And the very first crop circles that he was looking at, simple circles, he created a model that explained that using, this is just atmospheric vortices that are creating them. But over time, as he continued to collect data and more information, he kind of modified that because there was evidence of some kind of heat associated with this. And so he then changed or modified his hypothesis to say that it was some kind of plasma, electrical plasma, uh, associated with the vortex that was creating these. And, you know, he worked on that for about 10 years. I think it was probably in like year 7 or 8 is when he wrote his first book on crop circles. And he organized, after that, he organized a conference at Oxford University, I think, where he got scientists from around the world to come together and share their information about atmospheric vortices and plasma vortexes and electrical plasmas that ball lightning and things like that. And it was that they published a conference proceeding on that, which I think was called Circles in the Sky, about 1990. And the following year, there was like a massive explosion of a number of crop circles in England. And at the tail end of that season, that summer, was when the famous Doug and Dave incident happened, and it shut it all down. Like the media was so relentless in promoting that story, even though it was not true to any great extent. They promoted that, and it really drove scientists away from the subject completely.
Mhm.
So
Mission accomplished, it appears.
yeah.
So he was Meaden the one who, or was it Levengood who came later, who published the paper about meteorite particles, right? It was.
Yeah, that was my late friend W.C. Levengood, the biophysicist. He and I used to live not too far from each other in Michigan. He lived in Grass Lake, and I was from Plymouth, which is not too far away from each other. So I used to take my plant samples directly over to him. We would, work on that stuff in the lab together. That that caused some consternation with one of the other members of the BLT that didn't like the fact that I was dealing directly with Levengood. But I had a pretty decent relationship with Levengood and John Burke, two of the BLT that worked on those. What's that?
Was it the T and BLT research that had a problem with you
Yeah.
conferencing? Okay, because I remember Nancy, I've spoken with her several times over the years, and she, while very good at her stuff, she could be a tad bit abrasive, you might say. So
Right.
I
Well,
want to ask you about BLT and your interactions with them. And
well, we
for our listeners, we should go over that, though. I'll let you go over that quickly, who they were.
Well, the founding of the ICCRA, the Independent Crop Circle Research Association, was a direct result of the lack of sharing of information coming from the T and BLT. I would go over and talk with Levengood, and he was completely free and open in terms of sharing what information that he had in terms of what he was studying. And of course, we were doing the same with him. But Nancy Talbot had kind of a control issue. She wanted to be the sort of public face of that group and was determined to make sure that all communication went through her. So if anybody was delivering plant samples, they had to send them to her, and then she would send them to Levengood for analysis. And the thing about it was, she lived, I think, in New York State at the time, and she wanted me to send plant samples that I collected from Michigan and Ohio and Indiana to New York so that she could turn around and send them back to Michigan to Levengood. And I thought that was ridiculous. And so I would just drive over to Levengood's lab and give them to him in person. And that really frosted her. And so she was not happy about it. But years later, we kind of came to an understanding, a little bit of a reconciliation, years later.
And we can understand from a scientific perspective, especially because this BLT research group was really the only game in town in terms of scientists to get. We can understand that control issue.
What really kind of frustrated many people was the fact that, they would go out to a crop circle and they would collect all these plant samples and they would send them off to Nancy Talbot, and that would be the last they ever heard of anything ever again. Whether or not Levengood worked on that stuff or not, they would never hear anything. They would never see any follow-up reports. There was it was like a black hole of information. We
Mhm.
know that people were collecting stuff, sending it in, but then there was no information coming out of that organization. And eventually, Levingood got to the point where he said, "Hey, I don't think people are reading my stuff." And I said, "I don't think anybody is, because that stuff is not getting out to people at all. It's, Nancy's like a blockade for that information." So he asked me to personally scan all of his lab reports
Hmm.
and put them online, which we did, and they're still up there to this day. So if you go out to ICCRA.org and you go into reports, you'll find a link to Levingood's reports there, and all of the lab reports that he had done um, are out there for everybody, freely available, so that everybody can go and read that stuff. And it was that was part of the reason for the ICCRA forming. Was there was a huge number of researchers across the United States and Canada that were frustrated with that information blockade and said, "Okay, we're just going to get together and we're going to share that information amongst all of us, instead of having to deal with one person controlling it all at one time." So that
Well,
was kind of the impetus for us. And there was a group of us that had been researching things together for a while before that, and we had sort of a loose affiliation, and that's really what the ICCRA is today. It's just a loose affiliation of interested parties that want to share information so that it benefits everybody, rather than one single person. So with the ICCRA, we don't take any advertising. We put all the information up online for free. We kind of removed the financial equation out of it. We pay for it ourselves. We do all the work as volunteer basis. No one's getting paid for anything. No one's making any money off of it. We just do it for the pure interest and love of trying to solve this phenomenon. And we've been dedicated for doing that for about 20 years now, or a little over 20 years.
yeah, and we need that. And we also need more scientists looking at something like this from a scientific perspective. It reminds me of so many
Right.
other areas. We're finally getting, say, the UFO, UAP thing, we're finally getting enough scientists to hit a critical mass where it can no longer be swept under the rug. It's hitting mainstream sources where people who wouldn't otherwise have looked at it at all, or scientists who wouldn't have considered it in the realm of science. And crop circles, it seems like, never quite hit that critical mass. Thanks to people like you, it's been kept alive. But BLT
You
research
know,
we should
there
talk
was,
about who John Burke, right,
yep,
was the
John
big,
Burke.
um,
John Burke was a physicist.
mhm,
W.C. Levengood was a biophysicist, and Nancy Talbot was a bluegrass music promoter.
right. She, she got, she I don't know what she did. She kept the group together, but she also
Yeah.
kept it from moving into the realm of more publicity and more serious scientific inquiry and just freedom of information.
I think from her perspective, she was trying to be protective and not let Levengood get overwhelmed with inquiries. Levengood was a particularly solitary individual. Um, he liked to do his research by himself in his lab for the most part. He could be an abrasive guy. Also, I always got along with him perfectly fine. I never had, he kind of, I don't know, took a shine to me or whatever, but
Mhm.
um, he rarely collaborated. He had very few people that he trusted to collaborate with, and so Nancy, I think, was trying to be protective of him in certain ways. John Burke was one of his few collaborators. They, did some work together. They wrote a patent together. If you want to see Levengood's, all of his patents, he did quite a number of patents of various things over the years. Wrote a lot of scientific papers, published in peer-reviewed scientific journals like Science and Nature, and like real scientific journals. And so he was like a pure scientist. And there are very few people like that that are working on their own today. And he could afford to choose to work on whatever he felt like he wanted to work on. And whenever something interested in him, like crop circles interested in him, he actually applied some knowledge that he had learned from other things that he had studied earlier in his career, and he started looking at how plants would be affected by certain energy. And that was kind of the focus of Burke and Levengood's work. I was very much interested in understanding the field work, but also understanding the theoretical frameworks around that. And you had mentioned about why scientists have not largely been interested in this subject. There was a gentleman at Duke University in the early 90s, a guy by the name of Michael Korost, who wrote a paper that I think goes some way in explaining that. The title of his paper was Cereology, meaning the study of crop circles. Cereology is what he named it, is a pre-paradigm science. Now, maybe some of your viewers and listeners may have heard that term paradigm before, or maybe paradigm shift before, but that term comes from a philosopher of science by the name of Thomas Kuhn at Harvard University, like back in the 60s, wrote this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in which he talked about, all scientific disciplines have like a framework in which they write a set of rules that everybody agrees upon. This is how we're going to study the scientific discipline. And they come up with their own, terminology, their jargon, the way in which they're going to view this, scientific discipline. And everybody agrees upon that. But then over time, as more data gets accumulated within that framework, somebody comes along and says, you guys aren't looking at this right. We have to change the framework. We have to break out of that paradigm. And they call that a paradigm shift. Well, what Michael Korost was saying is that the rules haven't been written yet for the study of crop circles. It's too new of a discipline. We don't really understand what the rule set should be. And, I think he made a powerful argument for understanding why scientists haven't really lent themselves to understanding the discipline, because they don't even know what the rules are or how to study it. And I think that over the course of the last since Terence Meaden has been working on it, he applied a framework using atmospheric physics, and he looked at it through that lens. Levengood and Burke looked at it from the lens of a biophysicist. There have been others that have looked at it through other lenses, and all of them have learned new things about their own discipline as a result of, studying crop circles, which is a really interesting idea. I've come around to the conclusion that perhaps crop circles are actually without paradigm, if you can wrap your head around that. That there are that's the reason why any of these different disciplines can look at crop circles, study them for any period of time, and walk away with new knowledge that no one in their own discipline had ever heard of before, until they started studying the crop circles using those methodologies. Things like, there was the professor of mathematics at Boston University that studied all the astronomical alignments at Stonehenge, Dr. Gerald Hawkins. And in his later years, he started studying crop circles and from a mathematical standpoint. And he discovered that there were these mathematical ratios that were appearing in a field where there were multiple circles. And he said that these were diatonic ratios. And then he discovered several geometric theorems that had never been previously described before based on the study of his crop circles. He identified 5 new geometric theorems that nobody knew about before, but he learned from studying the crop circles. Well, if that guy who's looking at it from a mathematics standpoint, a geometry, and a musical standpoint is learning new things, and then these other guys from other scientific disciplines are learning new things, then you come to a point where it's like, no matter what discipline that you bring your knowledge from, you end up learning new things. Then you really come to the conclusion that crop circles are really without paradigm. They're beyond paradigm, right? And that is a really difficult concept for Western science to wrap their heads around. What do you mean there's no paradigm? How do you study it? It becomes a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, work, just to begin to wrap our heads around what exactly is going on. And I don't think after, I've been looking at it for over 30 years and other people, longer, Terrence Meaden's still around, that if anybody says to you that they know how crop circles are made, they're just lying to you, because we really have no idea. Even after all this time, we can identify certain aspects of that, and we've learned certain things about the effects on the plants, and there's increased radioactivity, changes the electromagnetic fields. We can say certain things about crop circles, but why that phenomenon exists, we really have no clue. Clearly there are ones that people are making, but I set that off to one side. I mean, we can discern the difference between ones that are made by people and ones that aren't made by people. That was part of what the ICCRA was formed to do, was to, come up with a protocol for just determining which ones were made by people and which ones weren't. And, I've gotten into debates with other crop circle researchers about this. They tell me, "Hey, Jeff, you got to stop being the crop circle police." And I said, I'm not being like the crop circle police. That's not a thing. What I'm trying to do is, I don't personally want to waste my time going out to a field and spending hours and hours and money and, time and effort in studying what somebody stomped down with a board or a garden roller. I have no interest in that at all whatsoever. So it's much more interesting to me to look at what is the actual true phenomenon. So if we can determine the difference between the two, then I can spend my time examining only the ones that, is the true phenomenon, and not, what people are making. One of the debates I got into was, I've been told that some of the hoaxers have said that they're being inspired by the same source of consciousness that makes the genuine ones. And my response to that is, would you rather talk to God directly, or would you rather have the priest tell you what God said? I mean, that's a pretty simple question, right? Everybody would say, well, I just would rather talk to God directly. Like, nobody wants the middleman, right?
No.
You can't trust the middleman, right? So I just lean, I try to make
this implies, and for the people who have either forgotten what they learned about crop circles, because it's kind of, it's not front and center in the news anymore. It used to be for a period of time, or they're not familiar at all with what we're talking about. Can you just run over quickly, the criteria that Levengood and Company, BLT Research, and then the ICCRA have determined to be the distinguishing factors between a hoax, whether it's stomped, usually it's you're stepping on it with ropes and boards or whatever, or the genuine phenomenon, which again Meaden and Levengood said is a probably an electromagnetic vortic plasma force, and those are two very different things, obviously. Physical manual flattening and a plasma interacting with grain. So there are some specific things. Can you run over those half dozen or so criteria?
Sure. Well, Levengood published a peer-reviewed paper in the mid-90s in which he identified that there is this particular physical characteristic in crop circles that are not man-made by people, right?
Mhm.
The plants get flattened down, and then people go in and collect the plant samples, and they've sent them off to Levengood, and Levengood examines these plant samples. And what he determined was that in grass type plants, which is grass, wheat, barley, corn, those kinds of plants, there are growth nodes along the stalk of the plant. They're kind of like the knuckles on your finger. And there, usually 3 or 4 of them, maybe 5 or 6 on a stalk of corn because they grow taller. But those growth nodes are where new cells are born, and that basically is where the next shoot of the plant begins to grow. And those are a little softer and a little more pliable than the remaining stalk. The rest of the stalk is a little more rigid. There's usually like a waxy cuticle substance on the outside of the plant. And what happens in the event making a crop circle is that the plants heat up rapidly and it builds up pressure inside of the plant. Now, depending on how old the plant is, what stage of growth it is, if it's still green and pliable versus when it's dry and ready for harvest, okay? So if it's still green and pliable, what'll happen is those growth nodes, the pressure will build up and it will stretch them out. It'll elongate the growth node. And you can make a statistical measure. You measure all the growth nodes, you measure how long they are, and then you compare those to plants that have been unaffected at distances away from where the crop circle is in the same field. Same set of plants, same field conditions, just farther away. And you can compare the two populations and you can get a statistical number that shows you, hey, these ones that were flattened down, they have been stretched out and elongated. That is something that the hoaxers cannot manufacture. They can't duplicate it by stomping the plants down. Okay. The other thing that can happen is if the plants are drier, ready for harvest, they've turned brown already, they don't become, those growth nodes aren't as pliable. But what'll happen is the pressure will build up and it'll blow a hole from the inside out of the growth node. Again, not something that happens when you stomp plants down with a board or a garden roller. So there are 2 effects that one can examine by looking at the plants directly. You can get a statistical measurement showing that, hey, these plants that were flattened down, that's part of the phenomenon. These are affected plants.
And the important thing to note here is that this isn't just something that was concluded after examining 2 or 6 formations. It's 100 or something.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, he was looking at multiple dozens of crop circles, and he came
so
to
it's
those
not
observations.
a fluke. It's not, what's the law? Beer-Lambert, is that what you're talking about? Is that the correct
No, that's something else.
okay.
But I can talk about that in a
We don't
bit.
need to get that far into the weeds, of course, pun intended again, because there's no end to the crop circle puns. But the point is
Right.
that scientists have looked at this. There's physical laws. There are things that cannot be replicated by just stomping on grain, no
Now,
matter how, how you
now,
physically.
Levengood published that paper,
Mm.
and the ICCRA took that information, and we actually refined that process down to make it a little more strict.
Right.
So what we looked at was when plants get flattened down, there is a process that begins to take place. The plants that are flattened down are still alive, they're still growing, they're just bent over, and they're kind of stuck in that position. They sort of got soft, bent over, and they've re-solidified, the waxy cuticle hardened again. And so they're flat and they're not coming back up. But they try to reorient themselves to the sun.
Yeah.
And that process is called phototropism.
Mm.
That begins after about 24 hours of being flattened down. And so what we determined was that we did not want to make measurements of nodes that had an angle above 10 degrees.
Mm.
That was about like the natural variation. Nodes can vary within a normal field, but you get beyond 10 or 12 degrees, and that's an indicator that the phototropism has started to happen.
Yeah.
And we didn't want that extra bend of the stretching to occur when we made our measurements. So we decided that we were only going to make measurements that did not include any of that phototropism stuff to
Mhm.
even become more rigorous in terms of, you know, uh, determining what was authentic and what was not. Some people have gone into fields that have been flattened down by people,
Mhm.
stomped down, and then the phototropism begins, and they have these curved bends on the stalks, and they say, "Oh, do you see these magic bends? There are these magic bends in the field," and you say, "No, no, no, that's not a magic bend. That's
Mm.
that's just a normal, natural." Thing that is occurring. So the idea that there are these magic bends that are in the plants, that's not really a thing. That's part of that phototropism process that, if you get there right after, a crop circle has occurred and you see some serious bending, that's one thing. But if it's at more than 24 hours afterwards, that's part of the phototropism process. So we try to, you know, sift through all of that
Really
and
fine
really nail,
tune,
yeah,
fine
really
tune
nail
and
it down.
find some easy
Now there's
distinguishing
there's additional
characteristics.
things that one of the things that I contributed to the study was I began to measure for radiation in crop circles. Also later on expanded that to look at changes to the electric field and the changes to the magnetic field, and we found that as additional supporting evidence. So we would always do the node measurements. That's like the gold standard, and then we would do these other, kinds of tests. And you never know what you're going to find. It's always, kind of interesting. Whatever, we've tried a whole range of tests, and we've settled on a handful we think gives us some, sense of being able to determine, difference between man-made and not. But in the end, that's a very limited thing. Yes, we've determined that it's not man-made, but it doesn't really tell us much about why, why the crop circle happened, or,
But it does, it does a very important thing that you need to do in the beginning of any new
yes.
inquiry in science, and that is to when somebody takes a microwave oven out into the field and tries to say that this is how it was created. I mean, what you've done is expose the ridiculousness of the skeptics and the lengths to which they will go to
Yeah,
explain away things that are
sure.
scientifically intriguing and worthy of an investigation. And you just reminded me, I
Yeah.
I had my own, maybe this is what we talked about. I had my own experience, and because you had contact with Dr. Levengood, it sounds like regular contact with him. I was the person who went to Hug Point, Oregon on vacation, and I encountered circles
Yeah.
in the sand, and I thought, well,
Right.
that's very bizarre. It was it was like 33 concentric rings, and I just stood there looking at it and going, well, that's not normal. So we had some camera failures and other things around it, so I started to get very suspicious. Anyway, I submitted that to an investigator. I think we mentioned her in our pre-interview email. Named Ilis is how I
Right.
think her name was pronounced, and she said she submitted to Dr. Levengood. So I'm wondering, do you know anything about that particular submission? It was, of course, different. It wasn't crop. It was sand from a beach.
I don't think Levigan ever really issued a report that I remember about that. Um,
Hmm.
Ilis and myself, and there was, I think, about six other people across the United States
Hmm.
were part of the Center for Crop Circle Studies here in the United States. That was an organization that began in England, and they wanted people affiliated around the world. And there was literally like less than 10 people across the United States that had even responded to this. And so she was an early investigator in the US, over on the West Coast. I think she was from Washington or Oregon.
Uh,
Um, and then later, I
Seattle,
think she
or
moved
so.
back to New York State to take care of her mother or something like that. So that's a a name out of the past. I don't
Yeah,
really know what happened to her.
me neither.
It's
I
been
always wondered.
probably 15 years at least since I've been in contact with her. Almost none of the people that were part of that original group are still around, I don't think. I'm in contact with a handful of them, but that's it.
So
Uh,
my understanding, though, was that Dr. Levengood did, if he didn't issue an official report, and I think you're right, I don't think he did write it up, but I got a statement or an opinion on it from her.
yeah.
He found the sample very intriguing. It had I have it somewhere, 50% increase in anions or something in the sand. Something scientific.
You'll have to hunt that down. Send it
Mhm.
in. We'll put it up with the rest of his stuff.
I
We'll
will,
get it up
well,
on the
see, I
ICCRA.
documented it clearly because I knew it was something unusual at least. So I'll
Yeah.
forward that to you. But anyway, the point
You
really,
write about that in your Monkey and the Tetrahedron book?
it is, I believe it is in there. Again, I wrote that 25 plus years ago. So I don't even
Right.
remember what's in my own book. That's how long it's been. But there was the
Yeah,
point was that that may have been another indication of some energy acting on it that clearly wasn't the result of
sure.
someone walking on the beach or putting a
Yeah.
stick in the sand and making circles or
Yeah.
whatever. So there
I wonder if he found I not having looked at what he had written, I wonder if he had found he did limited soil testing in some crops. Some researchers would not just send plants, but they'd also send soil.
right.
And he did find that in many cases there were these little tiny iron spheres
Hmm.
that uh, tended to be like magnetized,
Yeah.
and there would be higher concentrations of them inside the crop circles than soil collected from outside. And that led to that thing that you mentioned about the Beer-Lambert effect,
Okay.
that Levengood identified that the distribution across a field was from a single pinpoint, and that energy fall off was
Yeah.
part of that physics
And it implies
Beer-Lambert effect.
it implies melting, right?
Well, that was Levengood's hypothesis, was that he also thought that there was some kind of plasma
Yeah.
vortex involved, but he believed that they were coming down from the ionosphere, and that perhaps this, all around us every day, there's this incessant meteoric rain that comes down, all this meteor dust. And he believed that these large, huge plasma vortexes in the ionosphere were collecting this stuff and coming down to the surface of the ground. And that's what was making the crop circles and depositing that stuff. I'm not so sure that that's the case. One of the things that one of our associates looked at one time with a X-ray diffraction study of that material was that it could have been just fly ash from like coal-fired power plants.
Mhm.
It looks almost identical, these little tiny spheres of stuff, and it pretty much operates the same way. It's very hard to tell the difference between whether or not it's meteoritic or it's fly ash, so we know how much pollution there's been, so maybe that has what I think is going on is there are high electromagnetic fields involved with the creation of crop circles, and it's probably drawing that material in
Mhm.
from the surrounding field and depositing it hot in higher concentrations on the plants and on the soil within the area that's been flattened. And so when you go outside of the circle, there's kind of a fall off in that because it's already been attracted and concentrated. I don't believe that it's because, there was some plasma vortex that collected it from the air and deposited it. I'm not sure that that's the case. I'm not sure how that would even work physically, but that was his hypothesis, Levengood's hypothesis.
Okay,
And
so
I should point out, I should note, a lot of people have called him Dr. Levengood. A lot of people referred to him as that, called him Doc or Lefty Levengood. But Levengood told me the story of that, and he he did go to the University of Michigan, and he was in the doctoral program, and he completed all of the work necessary for the doctoral program.
right,
But when he went for the orals of that doctoral research, there was one particular professor that he didn't get along with that kind of pissed him off in the middle of that, and he walked out and never
right,
went back. And he never got the certificate.
yeah.
So like his friends always referred to him as a doctor, but technically he
Mhm.
really didn't get the certificate paper. He did all the work for it, but never completed it.
Yeah, and
So
unfortunately, skeptics have used that as some sort of evidence against his credibility.
right.
And so, yeah,
Well,
tech,
because some people have referred to him as a doctor,
yeah,
and then when they go and look at him, they go, "Well, he doesn't really have that." Well, he's been forthcoming about saying that he never achieved it. So
of
I don't know what
course,
to make
yeah. If
about the
you
critics.
spend an extra few minutes to look into it, that becomes a non-issue. If you're a
Yeah,
reasonable person and you're not looking to debunk just for the sake of debunking, there are plenty of,
right. Yeah.
but
As we had this motto in the ICCRA, we had another biophysicist in our group, Dr. Charles Lietzau, who was a biophysicist from Wayne State University. And his motto, which he kind of gave to the ICCRA, is the data is the only authority.
right.
It doesn't matter if you declare yourself an authority or, whatever. Like, don't believe me. Don't believe the doctor, who says and makes a pronouncement. Look at the data. What does the data tell you? Right. So it's,
Yeah.
whatever your conclusions are, it has to be based on the data that you've accumulated.
Well, if you're like you or me, that's extremely important because I can tell you're an analytical person, so am I. And I think I agree with you. There's no doubt that there's something going on, and there's an abundance of evidence to suggest that this is a pursuit well worth delving into, as you have for decades, and I have looked at this stuff for decades too. So you can go to the ICCRA to see
Mhm.
these reports, right? Or links to the
Yeah.
reports. You can go to BLT research. I think is still going, even though John Burke has passed on, W.C. Levengood has passed on. Nancy Talbot,
Mhm.
as I understand, is in ill health. I don't know that
Yeah.
anyone knows more than that. And if you don't know, it probably means nobody knows. I don't know.
Uh, I I I know that as of last summer she was still alive. I know that she had had a stroke. We were getting in closer communication with each other. We had actually scheduled some time for me to take her through a bunch of the presentations that I had done at a certain point, that she hadn't seen yet. And then she missed that scheduled appointment, and I found out that she had had a stroke. So she was in recovery for quite some time after that, and we haven't really connected. So I don't really know what the status of her health is at the moment.
Okay, well, let's move on. I mean, I think
Yeah.
I really wanted to establish for listeners, viewers who again hadn't looked at this stuff for a while, and they believed from the beginning that I don't know what to believe because it's just hearsay and blah blah blah. Well, it
Yeah.
isn't just hearsay. There's a large body of work that would convince anyone with a scientific mind that there's something
Well,
here.
if I could add to that
You
just a
know.
little bit, the idea that I mentioned, the famous Doug and Dave incident,
Mhm.
that kind of brought a halt to the scientific process.
Right.
Those two gentlemen, they claimed that they had made all the crop circles in England and they said they started in 1978, and
Mhm.
they made all the crop circles from 1978 up into 1991.
Right.
And that's therefore all of the crop circles are fake. Therefore, the whole phenomenon is fake. The problem with that is, you know, here in the United States, we've been having all kinds of crop circles, and so have other countries around the world.
Right.
And uh, I did a presentation about 5 years ago, in which I examined crop circles that were reported in the Project Blue Book files.
Mhm.
Okay, most people think of Project Blue Book as all just UFO files,
Mhm.
but there are a number of crop circles that were reported, documented by the federal government, photographs, investigations that took place, grass samples collected, dirt samples collected, analyzed, and there are government files dating back into the 1950s. So 50s and 60s, long before 1978 comes around. We have over 125 reported crop circles from the United States before 1978, before Doug and Dave claimed that they began the phenomenon. So there's a problem with that. There's a real disconnect in terms of the public's perception of crop circles. Well, they're all fake. Remember those two old guys? They claimed they made them all,
Yeah.
right? Well, they didn't make them all. There were hundreds of reports of them before they even claimed to have started making them. And if you examine their claims, their claims actually fall apart upon closer inspection. It's really not 1978, but if you want to take their claim at face value, it still doesn't hold water. There were famous crop circles in Switzerland in the 70s. There were crop circles in Australia in the 1960s. There were documented cases, photographs, people see them. Crop circles are a tangible physical phenomenon that people can go and touch and investigate. It's not like seeing a UFO streak across the sky and then, people say, well, an eyewitness says this or that or anything. No, you can go to a field, you can stand in it, you can touch it, you can feel it, you can measure it, you can examine it. It's a physical thing. That's physical evidence, right? And that's one of the things I've tried to, help people to understand is the phenomenon is much more wide ranging and much, much more complex than anybody has really given it credit for.
And because you voluntarily brought the UFO issue into this, why don't you
Yeah.
spend just a minute? I mean, we're probably less than a half hour to go. We got so many things to go over, I think. Can you spend a minute or so talking about the connection, if any, between UFOs and crop circles from your perspective? Okay.
Zero.
Well,
There's
that goes
never
to
been,
the public
well,
perception.
there's been about 50 eyewitnesses of people watching crop circles form. And in none of those cases have people reported seeing a UFO make them.
Right. But that
Um,
is the persistent public perception which has
yes.
been generated.
So that goes to kind of a Western civilization perspective on phenomenon.
Mhm.
There is this tendency of trying to decide something. It is either A or it's B, right?
Right.
Um, there's a French philosopher that talks about this problem in Western civilization. There is a category of things that he calls undecidables.
Hmm.
Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, calls these undecidables. He uses the fun example of zombies. So
Mhm.
in Western civilization, you're either alive or you're dead. But in some cultures that believe in zombies, you have the zombie that's neither alive nor dead, right? There is this other thing. Well, I can tell you that with crop circles, the media makes the decision in their headlines. It's either A, aliens, or B, it's a hoax.
Mhm.
It's one of those two things. And that's the default position.
Yeah.
But I'm here to tell you that there may be many other possibilities to consider rather than just those two things.
Yeah.
And there may be multiple source causes for crop circles. Again, going back to, we really don't know the source cause of crop circles at this point.
Yeah, and that's why I would again stress that you need to go, if you're interested in this sort of the subject or want to get back into it, go to the ICCRA website and look at BLT stuff, and none of that implies aliens or UFOs. It implies something very interesting, but it's not necessarily some alien intelligence in the way that it's portrayed in the UFO, UAP, whatever you want to call it, this phenomenon.
I think that there's also kind of a historical connection. In the 50s and 60s, there would be people that would report UFO landings,
Mhm.
and there would be these flattened circles that were found. And they used to call them saucer nests.
Right. Yeah.
And there is this, like they would find a saucer nest,
Mhm.
which today when you look at photographs of those things, often many of those are classic crop circles, swirled flattened plants, and I think there's a little bit of a connection, sensationalist connection in the media's mind.
Mhm.
Well, UFOs, they're connected to these flying saucer nests, right? Well, that must be what crop circles are. We just changed the name of it. The nomenclature has changed, but it's the same thing. And, that's always a kind of a sensational headline to write. It's
Yeah.
UFOs.
National Enquirer stuff, and it's
Right.
oversimplified beyond belief, and people should not
Yeah.
automatically make that connection because the crop circle phenomenon in itself is fascinating. You don't need to drag in anything else that's not,
Right.
warranted. And so I feel like we've kind of been living in the 90s so far, and I love that because that's where it all started for me. I started getting into all this stuff. But I want to move to the present day and have your opinion on, what's the state of the phenomenon today? Is the Crop Circle Connector website, which I've visited every year for 20 some 30, whatever it's been around, you don't see as many reported. Is that a function of just fatigue of reporting, or is that a function of some major change in this phenomenon? Has the pre-paradigm phenomenon moved into another stage where it's saying, look, you guys got to, make your conclusions about this and get ready for the paradigm shift? Or, I mean, what's your take on how it's going today in this field
Well,
again?
what I can tell you is that, I'm based here in the United States. I largely look at the United States into a little bit more extent, Canada and Mexico, pretty much North America, I kind of keep an eye on. I pay much less attention to what's going on over in England and other European countries. A little bit, not too much. What I can say is that here in the United States and Canada, there have not been any reports of crop circles since 2012. So we've gone
That seems
over 10
unbelievable.
years without any reports of crop circles.
And I mean, that really, what side does that support? On one hand, it says that, look, people got tired of doing it and it's out of fashion, so blah, blah, blah. But then there's another side that says, look, that's a significant change. It's
Yeah.
indicates a significant shift
So here's
or
here's
mess.
looking at it from a larger historical perspective. If we look at the earliest reports of crop circles from the late 1500s in Europe, there was kind of a surge of reports of crop circles in the last half of the 1500s. And then there are no historical records of crop circles until you get to the end of the 1600s. So, like the last 10 or 15 years of the 1600s, there's a whole bunch of reports and then nothing. And then, you go about another 70 or 80 years, and then there's another wave of reports at the end of the 1700s. And it's the same thing in the 1800s. There's no reports, barely any throughout the mid part of the 1800s. But by the end of the 1800s, there's a lot of more reports. And then here in the 1900s, you can see, if you just chart them on a graph, there's kind of a low baseline number going along, and then all of a sudden you get to the last 2 decades and it just kind of takes off.
Mhm.
And you know, it continued into the first, you know, 10 years or so of the 2000s, but by 2009, the number had declined dramatically in the United States. And then by 2012, that was the last, major report. We did get one hoax report from the beginning of 2013, but we clearly identified it was man-made by the Team Satan people. They were doing an advertisement for NVIDIA for Las Vegas Consumer Electronics Conference or something like that. That was out in California. I identified it right from the aerials that I had seen, and turned out that was the case. But outside of that, no reports since.
Now, what
I may
about
have spotted one on a Google satellite photograph in 2013, but outside of that, there's been no
now?
reports.
I spoke with you, I think, by email saying that there was that formation in Wilbur, Washington, and
Yeah.
I happened to be on vacation heading that way when news of that came out. So I ended up going into that field and taking
Mhm.
100 photographs and measuring things and all this stuff. And it was like 100 degrees. I had two small kids. I dragged them out, and my wife at the time. It was just like they're sitting in the car in 100-degree weather while dad is up on the hillside, with tape measures. And I think, at least when I sent information to the T and the BLT research, Nancy Talbot, and she concluded that it was a mechanically flattened formation. It was a hoax, in other words. As far as I heard, nobody
Yeah.
ever claimed responsibility for it. That like many of them just kind of faded away. That I think was 20. Do you remember what year that was? 20
Well, we can check the ICCRA webpage
or
because we put up a report about it.
2013. Maybe it was around that end date that you're talking about.
Let's
But
see if I can
that
pull it up real quick.
it's just so strange that they've kind of ended or tailed off, and it's very hard to explain. People don't get tired of doing hoaxes, do they? Maybe they do. Um,
So the first one in Wilbur was in 2007, and then there was a second one in 2009.
is it that long ago?
Yep.
Maybe it was the '09 one that I'm thinking of. Well, I have a bunch of pictures of that and everything somewhere on a hard drive, but
Oh, you should send them to me. We'll put them up on the ICCRA page.
yeah, I'll have to have to look that up. But really, the reason for bringing that up was that was a number of years ago, longer than I had thought, apparently. And it's true, you don't hear about crop circles anymore. And what is your going to the more esoteric areas of this, which is probably what a lot of people tuned in for, and I apologize to them because you got two science nerds here saying, "Hey, what about the measurements of the
Yeah.
nodes and blah blah blah." People don't really care as much about that as they care about the more fun aspect, the more otherworldly aspect. Can you talk about that aspect as far as your opinion on what these things may mean?
Well, I can tell you that we tried very diligently to make sure that we discerned ones that were man-made or not man-made. And once we made that determination, then we would do a higher level analysis of various crop circles. We would examine the geometric patterns of it. We would look at whether or not there were diatonic ratios for things like, is there music encoded in the design of it? We would look at the symbology of it and try to, discern what it is. And each circle is, quite a bit different from another one. The very last circle that we did a major investigation of, in fact, it was the very last one that W.C. Levengood worked on before he passed on, and that was in Ohio at a place called just outside of the city of Chillicothe.
Mhm.
And it was one of the largest crop circles ever reported in the United States, over 40 circles and rings in a particular pattern. And that particular pattern was a fractal design. So if you're mathematically inclined, fractals are kind of an equation that describes the boundary conditions between order and chaos. And there are different equations that you can write that will generate different repeatable patterns that go on to, basically for infinity.
Right.
And this was a particular fractal. And I spent about a month looking through different fractals, hundreds and hundreds of fractals to try to find one that matched. And I finally found one. And the only place I've ever seen this written about this particular kind of a fractal was in an obscure mathematical journal called Fractals, published by a physicist by the name of M.S.L. Nachi, who's an Egyptian physicist. And he wrote about this particular kind of a fractal. It's called a heptagonal hyperbolic planar tessellation.
Okay.
And what that means, heptagonal is seven-sided, and the planar is the projection. The tessellation means it repeats onto the infinity. And so essentially, this is a two-dimensional version of this three-dimensional repeating heptagonal seven-sided fractal. And what MSL Nachi, the tessellation just means it goes on, repeating. What he said about this kind of a fractal was that it was the fundamental basis for our reality. That in string theory and physics, when you look at the geometry of how the entire, our entire existence, everything in the universe exists, is on this particular kind of fractal pattern at its very core, very minute nature. So what does that tell you? When I looked at that fractal and I spent a month searching through fractals to find it, there's probably less than 20 people around the world that haven't even heard that term or knew what that was. And yet you have it as an example on the macro scale in 2 dimensions in this farm field in, south central Ohio. Those are questions that really stretch your mind. That it really you really have to think very carefully about what is really going on here, right? I don't know that we've gathered enough information to really understand the phenomenon in a more fundamental way. When I give general lectures about crop circles, I always start out with a definition of what crop circles are. I say, this is sort of an agreed upon definition. Crop circles are swirled, flattened patterns in, plants, in fields, right? That seems like a simple definition. But I always finish at the end of going through all of these completely unbelievable things that we've discovered about crop circles. And I come to the end of it and I ask the question again, well, what are crop circles? And the answer to that is, we don't know. Yes, they are swirl flattened circles in a farm field, but that doesn't really tell us much about them, from just a simple description standpoint that can tell us a little bit about them. But it can't tell us why they would appear with different kinds of geometries. Why would they incorporate musical, mathematical ratios into their designs? Why they appear in close proximity to prehistoric ancient sites? Why do they appear near bodies of water? Why do they appear near, electrical power lines? There's a whole range of things that we can correlate and understand about them and describe these various aspects of them. But in the end, we're still left with a big mystery. And, there are so many different things that I could talk about crop circles for hours and hours and hours. I have on, other podcasts. If you want me to come back and focus on various aspects, we can do that. One thing that really tends to blow people away is I did a project in the mid 2000s where I mapped all of the crop circles across North America.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when Google Earth Pro came out. And you could take aerial photographs of crop circles and import them and put them right into the program. So you could actually not just put a dot on the map, but you could get the crop circle in their correct orientation. And sometimes some of the satellite photos captured the crop circles as well. So we knew exactly what their orientation was and so on and so forth. And one of the things I found was that crop circles are not just single one-off events that happen in a given place at a given period of time, but that they seem to have a relationship with one another. What I mean by that is many crop circles have these straight line geometric components to their design. Well, if you take that straight line and you extend it across the landscape, extend it across the map, more often than not, they will come to another crop circle. And not just like glancing blow or something. It'll go right to the center of it. Mm-hmm. And not just ones that have happened in the past, but they've also pointed to where ones happened in the future. So they hadn't yet occurred. Mm-hmm. So that raises some fundamental questions about, well, were all the crop circles planned out in advance and they're just slowly unfolding over time? Or maybe there's some hidden underlying geometry to our existence that we don't know about, but that only gets revealed when these energetic events occur. There are really, really deep fundamental questions about crop circles that we don't know what to make of. And the average person, just sees these things out in a field and they don't really understand what that is or what that means. And, oh, it's the aliens making them, or, oh no, it's just those old guys, stomping the plants down, or, some practical joker. No, that we did not find any relationship between any man-made circles and anything else. We only found that with the ones that we, could determine were not man-made. Mm. And sometimes the distances were, hundreds of miles away from each other over the course of many years. So, those are real challenging things to think about. And that's still where we're at. Even at, not having any circles for over a decade, we're still learning more about circles and trying to solve those questions.
Okay, so Jeff, I want to ask you, I know you've done some work on some of the what do you call it? Mounds, earthworks, structures that are particularly prevalent in the Midwest, in Ohio, I know.
Yep.
And I think this is what you were talking about was a perfect segue into that information. I would like to have another show with you later on to get into detail on that stuff alone, because
Sure.
it's a whole show's worth of, many shows worth.
Here's what I wrote. These.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote these. This is like the phone book, But
Yeah.
this is Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, the expanded edition, Volume 1 and Volume 2. These are in paperback. There's actually 3 volumes in hardcover, and that book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, was written by 2 gentlemen from Chillicothe, Ohio, that I mentioned that crop circle coming down at. Mm-hmm. They wrote a book that was published by the Smithsonian in 1848. And for the 175th anniversary of its publication, I reissued that book as an expanded edition. Their original book was about 350 pages. I added about 1,000 pages to it. Talking about all of these early efforts to map the earthworks in the Midwest, mostly in the Ohio Valley, and some farther down the Mississippi. But yeah, so I got interested in that through crop circles. Many of the crop circles were showing up near Indian mounds, and I wanted to understand what that relationship was a little bit better. And I had spent about 20 years researching that, and I put this book out. I'm in the midst of editing a book right now about the Portsmouth, Ohio earthworks. That's written by a young woman by the name of Emily Aldrich, and I'm going to be publishing that sometime this year. I'm also writing a multi-volume book about Serpent Mound. I now live next door to Serpent Mound with my wife, who I met at a crop circle, and my wife Delcy Wilson, and so we now live next door to that mound. I've been involved in efforts to preserve many of the prehistoric earthworks in Ohio. Managed to save, a few of them from development, destruction, and so I have a kind of a passion for that history, the prehistory of Ohio, and the prehistory of the United States, and the preservation aspect of it too. So.
Well, you
You can follow, viewers can go out to Substack. I have a column on Substack under Jeffrey M. Wilson, and you can read about 20 excerpts from that book if you want. I put up one a week. There's so many stories in there. It would take me, a couple of years to get through half of them. So I've got plenty of material to put up, another story every week. So.
And so you hinted at least, again, like I said, it was a good segue into these earthworks, which, of course, that's what I thought when you're talking about pointing to each other, intersecting lines, earth geometry. So I have two questions. I don't know which one you want to tackle first, but did you work with Carl Monk?
No, but I'm familiar with this work.
So you're familiar with his work. I want to have your opinion on that. And then the other question, well, it was about Serpent Mound. So what do you know about Carl Monk? Because I was always unsure what to think about his.
I got introduced to Carl Monk's work through Richard Hoagland.
Okay.
I became acquainted with Richard Hoagland in the early 90s. After his work on, the Face on Mars and the Cydonia stuff. My father wrote a couple of books that have become classics in UFO literature. He wrote a book called Our Mysterious Spaceship Moon, and a second book called Secrets of Our Spaceship Moon. And when Richard Hoagland had started, publishing books on Cydonia and the Face on Mars, he then I contacted him because my father had an unpublished manuscript that didn't get published called Mysterious Mars. And it was largely based on the work of DiPietro and Molinaro, which was what Hoagland ended up writing about, right? And so there was this unpublished manuscript that my dad had done about the Cydonia area and the Face on Mars. And so I kind of got in touch with Richard and shared that stuff with him and said, here's my dad's books about the moon. And then he turned and started looking at the moon. In the midst of all that, there was this archaeological site that was discovered in Miami, Florida. There was this kind of stone circle that was discovered, and I was an advisor to my local congresswoman's. She was on the science committee in the U.S. House of Representatives, and I was on a committee to help advise her of different science things, and that would come up before Congress. And I saw this notification about there was this, archaeological site that had been discovered, but it's going to be destroyed through development. And so, I contacted the congresswoman to say, hey, I think this is something that we should try to prevent from happening. And she started working at it from a congressional side. But then I contacted Hoagland because he had a pretty big audience at that time. And I said, hey, what can you do to help? And he got very much involved. He flew to Miami, actually chained himself to a bulldozer to prevent the destruction of that site. And so, I've been involved in those kinds of preservation efforts for nearly as long as I've been, looking at crop circles. And I'm happy to, get involved in just about any effort, because I think, they're not making any more of these prehistoric sites. Once somebody destroys them, they're gone, and I think it's all part of our heritage. We should try to honor it and try to preserve it, being an American citizen. So
So as far as the relation or the alleged relations between earthworks in various parts, mostly Native American, but also some totally unidentified and unexpected structures, and then going all the way to the other world, other side of the world, you're talking about Egypt, and I mean, how much of that is a bridge too far? How much of it is just statistical manipulation versus what you think are
It's
real connections
yeah.
or likely?
I think Karl Monk's work is a lot of numerology stuff.
Mhm.
He's taking decimal point numbers and he's creating relationships out of these decimal point numbers. And I think that it begins to get really shaky in terms of something really factual, because you can draw a line around the world and probably hit 75 archaeological sites no matter what line you draw, probably more. So are they all connected? No, I don't think they are. you know um but there does appear to be a correlation between crop circles and Native American earthworks that we know about in the United States.
Mhm.
The one of the criteria that we looked at was, after we got a huge number of investigations under our belt, we determined that there were like essentially four criteria. Crop circles don't happen anywhere and everywhere across the landscape. They only happen when these certain conditions are present. One is that in 95% of the cases that we looked at, the ones that we determined were not man-made, they came down in close proximity to a power line, that the closest power line pole had a transformer box on it. They were coming down in close proximity to some body of water, creek, pond, drainage ditch, right over the top of an aquifer. But then there was this fourth criteria that in 65% of the cases, they were coming down in close proximity to Native American mounds and earthworks. And we think that the number is probably higher, but that so many of the mounds and earthworks have been destroyed and there are no records of a lot of that stuff. The correlation was probably even higher than that.
Mhm.
And so I really wanted to understand what that was, to try to discern, look through a Native American lens at this. What kind of stories and oral traditions and what were their ways of looking at the world that might be able to give us some insight into looking at the crop circles. And so, I spent quite a bit of time trying to understand that.
There have been other efforts, probably less rigorous than what you've done, I'm guessing, but I know there was it Hasselhoff did the deepening complexity of crop circles. He kind of delved a little bit into that. I've looked him up and I've never been able to find out what happened to him. Like a lot of the crop circle researchers, they've either died or they've just gone off into obscurity. So there's
Oh
Hasselhoff.
well, he kind of left. He was a physicist,
Mhm.
and he left academia and left physics behind, and he has focused on his musical career. He plays
Hmm.
classical guitar, I think,
Okay.
and that's what he does. So
Well, that's quite a transition in career, choices.
yeah,
But he did make a
yeah.
book that to me was compelling. I've got it back here. I should read it again because it was very interesting. And then there was the other one. Where was I can't remember the name. I'm sure you know, claiming that crop circles were some sort of blueprint, the plan or it was a very simple title, if I remember. Basically, the author was arguing that they were pieces of like a ship or something, if you took this
oh yeah, yeah. I think I remember that book.
this
He
shape.
actually was like cutting out patterns like in like cardboard or whatever, and creating three-dimensional models and
Yeah,
spinning
yeah.
them on a turntable. I think the book was called The Gift. Was it was
Something
it
like that. It was like a
Doug Ruby? Doug Ruby, I think, may have authored that.
I knew
I
you
never met
would.
Doug Ruby. I don't know what to make of that stuff. It's
Well,
kind of an interesting.
it's
It's a different framework,
mm,
right? Like, from coming from a scientific perspective, I go, oh, well, that's just rubbish. But really, what it is he is looking at it from a completely different lens than from what a person with a scientific lens is looking at it. And he is saying, well, if you do this, and this is a methodology then I can create these kinds of things from looking at these crop circles. Is there something to that? we don't really know. I find works like that to be interesting to look at because I've always come at trying to understand this problem that no one person is going to solve this. We're going to need a collective amount of people that look at it from various perspectives to really begin to make sense of what this is. Science has a very, very narrow focus, and it looks at the world in a very particular way. But there are other ways of knowing things that don't fall into the scientific category, right? And science has not been able to explain everything at this point. There's a very famous quote by a physicist around the turn of the century in the late 1800s, Lord Kelvin, who said, "We've discovered everything. We know what everything is now. It's just a matter of sorting out the details." That is far from the case.
Yeah.
I remember when I was getting my degree at Eastern Michigan University in the physics department, every week we would have a meeting of our astronomy club, and I would bring news articles that had come out that prior week talking about some new scientific discovery that challenges the standard model of physics.
Right.
Well, after you go, 100 weeks in a row where some article comes out and says, this challenges the standard model, this challenges the standard model, this challenges the standard model. Well, how many holes do you punch in the standard model before it's like Swiss cheese? We have to replace that at some point. There was a model of how the cosmological world that got kicked over, by Newton. And then, a period of time goes by and Einstein comes along and kicks that model to the curb. And then there's the Einstein model. Well, then quantum physics comes along and throws a wrench into all of that. Well, there's going to come a point where there's going to be something new to replace that and further our understanding of how the cosmos actually works and how everything, fits together. I think crop circles is one of these things that seems to go beyond the boundaries of the frameworks that we understand today. And it's very difficult to wrap your head around because it doesn't fit into any of these neat boxes. So that's what I say is, I don't know what perspective the author of The Gift had, but he came up with a completely different way of looking at crop circles than anybody else. Ilis had one that was totally different. She wrote a monograph about how she thought that all the crop circles were made from sound, right?
Yeah.
And she wrote a whole, 100+ page, paper essentially about that. And you say, okay, well, how do you test that? How do you gather enough evidence to, confirm that idea? Nobody has followed up on any of her work, there are many, many, little threads here and there of things. There have been maybe a half a dozen experiments where people have sat and meditated on particular geometric designs, and then they showed up later as crop circles. The ICCRA did a one of those experiments, and we had sort of mixed results. Is there a link between consciousness of people and can we influence the environment to, have a crop circle occur? Or are we communicating with some other consciousness that is answering us back that we don't really understand? I mean, there are a lot of big, heady questions about crop circles that we haven't really, even began to scratch the surface on. A lot of stuff.
And that might be
fun mystery.
That may very well be their purpose. Now, I just watched the movie Contact a couple weeks ago. Carl Sagan,
Sure. Yeah,
party shot or whatever before he died, based on his book, of course, and it painted the picture kind of like this person who wrote The Gift, if that's what it is. That sounds right. I don't remember, but I'll have to look that up. Ruby, you said? Ruby?
I think it was Doug Ruby that wrote that, but I could be wrong. I'm not sure.
Well, so instead of like in Contact, we get this message from out there, and the scientist Jodie Foster and her group all go to reconstruct it. And well, what it is a blueprint, literally pieces to create this time machine or this time and space machine. I think looking at it from that perspective may be too simplified, because it doesn't appear to be anything like an instruction manual. It's just too open to interpretation. So to me, and it sounds like what you're saying is that these things are being creative to invoke or provoke, that creative process in us just for the sake of creating that creativity, activating that creativity gene or whatever you want to call it, that tendency that we have to make us think and ponder. It might not
Well,
be very
we certainly have many examples of new discoveries that have been made in various fields as a result of that, particularly in math and geometry. There have been a bunch of new geometric theorems that have been discovered. There have been one researcher friend of mine, Alan Brown, he studied this particular Celtic cross pattern of crop circles that were repeatedly happening over in England. And when he started looking at them based on a suggestion by another crop circle researcher by the name of Michael Glickman, he said he thought that maybe they solved a geometric puzzle known as squaring the circle. And so Alan Brown, a geometry, he started studying that, and he looked at about 50 different versions of these, Celtic cross patterns, different sized circles, spaced differently apart, but essentially 5 circles, like on a dice. And he discovered 50 new ways of being able to square the circle that geometers had never discovered before. Up until the time he started studying that, there were 6 known ways. By the time he got done, there were 56 new ways. And then I sent him a couple from the United States, and he discovered 2 more ways on top of that. So this is new knowledge that nobody had learned before just by studying the crop circles. And so, it's a real puzzle as to what to make of that kind of knowledge. And
it hints, because part of the skeptical view, which has legitimacy, of course, when it's used properly, but someone could argue, well, this is just a bunch of MIT students, whatever, having their Friday night nerd out party, and they're like, let's go make a crop circle that has a complicated equation in it and see if anyone decodes it. But that stretches credulity at some point. Like what you're saying right now is that you get into completely new theorems or completely new ideas that nobody, even the top scientists, have. Then you're kind of pushing it a little bit, saying that some college students are just playing around or something, and that implies, of course, that there's some sort of intelligence or intelligent form behind it, or creative form. The question is it
maybe
us, projecting ourselves? Is it humans? Is it some alien intelligence? Is it just the universal consciousness, whatever? And you're probably right. We're never going to figure that question out, at least until it's time for us to know something like that. But it feels like it's pretty far down the road, doesn't it? Or sometimes it doesn't. I don't know.
It may take for the next century to roll around for the next wave to happen, and then and the next group of crop circles to show up for the next group of people to try to figure it out. I don't know. It appears that at least for the moment, we're not seeing really any more here in North America.
Yeah, and that in itself is very intriguing, but the whole cyclical.
That's part of the reason why I always tell people, the historical information is really important to document. And it's important, like you've got 2 sites that you've been to, and you've been sitting on that information, but it really hasn't been shared out to the wider world. The ICCRA website was like the Crop Circle Connector, was put together to archive that material. That's why we archive, the material from Levengood. I've been in touch with some of the other early researchers to try to get their archives of stuff so that it gets out there to the world too. And I've had some, success with that because I think they realize that, and I did all that work, decades ago, and nobody's really paying any attention to it or looking at it. But it is important material to preserve, and we in our era may not solve it, but maybe 100 years from now or 200 years from now, somebody's going to come along and read that material and go, wow, look at how close they were. Look at what they
Yeah.
had found. Look what they did, and maybe they can make a breakthrough. I don't know. We go back and look at these historical records from the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. And, in the 1700s, there was a whole series of articles written back and forth between a whole group of people arguing back and forth. What are these things? And there was one camp that said, no, these are just fungus rings. And the other group is like, no, 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 these are swirled, flattened circles. But they all called them the same thing. They all called them fairy rings.
Mhm.
And that was the terminology back then. Today we call them crop circles. But, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they were calling them saucer nests. Like the nomenclature might change, the terminology might change, but we're really identifying the same sorts of things. It's only been in our area that we managed to gather enough scientific data to really nail down that this is a true phenomenon of some sort. Maybe it's going to take, another century or two to figure out, what exactly is going on. I don't know, but.
Well, I mean, what you're showing is that it's very important to preserve that information for posterity, as with the native landforms and the things that are being bulldozed under and buried and forgotten. We should learn this lesson, even though it seems like we don't. With ancient sites, we should not underestimate what that civilization was trying to communicate to us. And it feels like the crop circle issue is the same and just a different format. And I appreciate what you've done to keep this alive. And unfortunately, as we've seen, people die, people get old. You lose, the knowledge goes with them if they're mad scientists working in their basement, and they don't share it with everyone else, kind of like Doctor, I'll
A
call him
perfect
Dr.
example
Levingood. Mm-hmm.
perfect example of that is John Burke from BLT.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a book
Yeah,
based on his work that he had done with Levingood on the crop circles. It was a book called Seed of Knowledge, Stone of
right.
Plenty.
Yep.
And he co-wrote that with another gentleman by the name of Kaj Hallberg. Well, Burke died.
Yeah.
Burke had all the information for the book. Kaj Hallberg didn't have it.
Oh,
And Kaj went to, Burke's widow, and it's all gone. And so, Kaj Hallberg has put up chapters of that book now available online at his website so that people can read that book. The book is out of print, and all of the material, all the research material that went into that book, it's all gone. And all the crop circle stuff that Burke worked on, all that material is lost. I fear for like Colin Andrews' archive, or
mhm.
Pat Delgado, who's since died, or Busty Taylor, and those guys that started out early in the early days, or people like Terrence Mead, who's fortunately still alive. At some point, that material is going to go somewhere, and hopefully it doesn't go to a landfill. Hopefully somebody steps up to preserve it. I'm happy to try to do that, but and that's what the ICCRA was founded for. But I realize that my lifetime is only going to be so long. Who's going to take over after I go away? There has to be some longer lived institution that's going to have to get interested and jump in to try to archive and host this material at somewhere at some point.
Yeah, and it makes you realize how you look back on, well, even of a recent example,
I'll
the
give I'll give you
NASCAR.
one real good example.
Uh-huh.
Paul Anderson, he was the head of the Canadian Crop Circle Research Network, CCCRN.
Mhm.
They had a functioning website like the Crop Circle Connector for all the Canadian sites, just like the ICCRA was doing for the United States. And he had, for every single Canadian site. Well, he had that hosted on GeoCities. And when
Right.
GeoCities went out of business,
Mhm.
bye bye CCCRN site. no way to reconstruct it all. All the photos are gone.
Yeah.
All the material that was collected by all those researchers is gone. I was able to go into the Internet Archive and get, some of the text material and identify the specific sites, not to the nth degree, but,
Mhm.
just from like the closest town or whatever. But all of that material that was up in Canada is now gone into the ether, you know.
It's just a hard drive failure away from disappearing forever in our era. At
Right,
least in
exactly.
ancient times, they used giant stone monuments that would erode only
Or,
over thousands of years, and here
get the
we are.
giant book out, right?
Yeah.
Which I have intentions of, after I get my series done of Serpent Mound, I'm probably going to try to put together a series on the crop circles, because I know that a book archive of it will last longer than probably what'll happen online. At some point that online will eventually, degrade or disappear, whatever. And I hope to preserve, that knowledge that somebody, 100, 200, 500 years in the future might find that book and, get interested in it. So,
Well, you've been doing great work. I appreciate that, to see it happening, and appreciate talking with you today. And I would like to do a follow-up
yeah,
chat
sure.
with you on the earthworks, because that's very fascinating. I think our viewers would really like to see that detail too, because that presents a different picture of ancient history and how the Native Americans viewed everything as interconnected. They had the foresight to connect these structures, plan in such a way that showed how important it was to them. And I think modern civilization doesn't really have as much of an appreciation for that sort of thing, and that may be part of what the crop circles are trying to teach us also, is that things are interconnected to a point where you need to recognize that commonality between them. One of the many different interpretations, but that seems like a reasonable one to me. But we'll get into that later if you're willing to do another interview sometime in the future here. We'd
Sure.
love to have you back on Anomalies. I'm going to let you go.
Happy to do
It's
it.
been a while, and I know that
Thanks.
you're running out of time here.
Yeah,
Um,
I've got an exit stage left.
I know you got to do that. But again, thank you, Jeffrey Wilson. I appreciate the
Well,
conversation.
thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
We'll have another one soon.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye.